So I got cut off in my first video. My phone rang and then the microphone wouldn't work, so I just ended it so I would not lose what I had done. And I think I had said, for example, if tries is a 7, then what we're going to do is we're going to set our counter equal to 1, and we're going to add 1 to it each time, and we're going to loop 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. So as long as the variable I has a value less than or equal to 7, we'll loop. Okay, so then what we're going to do is we're going to use the cast method of this die class that was created here to get back a simulation of a die roll for a 6-sided die. And we're going to store that in the variable n. Then we're going to print it out, and we're going to continue on running this loop. Now, so some of you had asked me some questions about declaring a variable inside of a loop. So the general consensus among programmers is that you should declare a variable in the smallest scope possible, meaning that if you're only going to use this n variable inside the loop, if you don't need to reference it outside of the body of the loop, then the scope of that variable, where it needs to exist, how long it needs to exist, where it needs to be usable or visible, is only inside the for loop. So once I get out of the for loop, I really don't need to reference the die n, the number n again. I'm really just using n to hold the value that comes back from casting my die so that I can then figure out my statistics. But I don't need to keep track of I don't need to hold in memory each roll indefinitely. I don't need to say outside of the loop what was the last roll of the die. That's not important in this case. So the scope of this variable, the only place I really need to have the variable n is within the for loop. So in that case, it's appropriate to actually declare it and initialize it in the for loop. So every time the for loop runs, the 7 times in my example that this for loop is going to run, it's going to create n, put a value in it, reference it, and then when the second loop comes along, it more or less destroys n, recreates it, puts the new die roll in it, goes through the body of the loop. Now I is a 2, it comes back, or I is a 3 rather, it comes back. It recreates n, so n is sort of destroyed and recreated 7 times because it is declared and initialized within the loop. So each time this thing iterates, it destroys and redeclares and recreates, reinitializes n. That's fine because we don't need to reference n outside of the loop. Now, should we have a variable that we need to reference later on in the code outside of the loop, then we've got to declare it outside of the loop. We might reference it in the loop, but we've got to declare it outside. Okay, so I know that's a little tricky. Now, if you did not declare your variable inside the loop, if you decided to come here and do int d equals 0 to start it out, or sorry, n, and then you just wanted to do this, that's acceptable. Lots of people do that. Programmers who are very, very into programming and try to do everything in the best possible way will say you should really declare it and initialize within the for loop because you're not using it outside of that. To me, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. And there are all kinds of debates on the internet about which is more efficient, declaring it outside the loop or declaring it inside the loop and having it recreated each time this thing runs. And some people say it doesn't matter. Some people say it eats up CPU cycles. It's whatever you want to do. So this is perfectly fine and acceptable to declare it in here. You can also declare it outside. And I'm mentioning that because you will see code in your book and in other places where they will sometimes declare things outside the loop and sometimes within the loop. Either way is fine in this case. Now, so we print it out and then we come down here. Now, here's the issue where we may not want to declare a variable within the for loop. We've got what we call accumulators here. These are variables we're setting up to hold or accumulate or count the number of times we rolled a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, and a 6, so we can look at our statistics. Out of 7 rolls, how many times do we roll a 1 or a 2 or a 3, and so on. So these are accumulators. They're going to accumulate a value for me each time the code runs. The thing about declaring those within the for loop is I can't reference them outside of the for loop in a print line, which is really what I want to do. I want this thing to run however many times. In my example, it's 7. I want to count how many 1s, 2s, 3s, etc. And then after the loop is done, before I exit the program, then I want to reference these variables and print their values out. So in this case, the scope of these accumulators is really larger than the for loop. I need the scope to be for the whole program. If I declare them in here, and say on my first roll I roll a 1, so I have a loop that says, hey, add 1 to the 1 counter to accumulate or let me count how many 1s I've got, that's great. The problem is the second time the loop runs, it throws away and destroys the variable 1 count. I lose the 1 that was in there. It reinitializes it to 0. On my second loop, I roll another 1. I'm back to having a 1 in here. I never get, these variables keep getting reinitialized back to 0 every time this thing runs. So I'm never going to get the right values here if I declare them in the for loop. So that's a case where I really do want to come outside of the for loop and declare and initialize these variables and then use them within the for loop and print them out after the for loop. So I'm going to set them up here, and then all I need to do, honestly, is just let my if logic take over. They're declared, they're all set to 0. Then I come in here, when I get a 1, I bump up the 1's counter, a 2, the 2's counter, and so on. And then I really want to print out, I don't want to print within the loop, because that's every time this loop runs, I'm going to get, you rolled 1, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4, and the next time 2, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4. That's not what I want. I really want it to do the accumulating, and then outside of the loop, one time for each counter, I want my total statistics. So hopefully that helps you see the difference between declaring within the loop, because I'm never going to use in outside of the loop, but the counters I need to declare outside of the loop because I'm going to use them both in and outside of the loop. And it's probably a little more efficient here if I use an else if. If I use simple if statements, n is a 1, it bumps up the 1 count, and I know that it's not a 2, 3, or 4, but because these are standalone if statements, they're not related to each other. They're individual if statements at this point. It's still going to check and see if n is 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, even though it knows it's a 1 and it's done, and it's going to be a little inefficient. It's going to eat up CPU cycles. So it's better to make, instead of having 6 different if statements, let's have one else if statement. So this becomes one if statement here once I make these other or else ifs. So now I've got a little more efficiency. If it's a 1, it will bump up the 1's counter. It will skip to the end of the loop. It'll bump up I to whatever the next value is. It'll make sure I is less than or equal to 7, which is what's in tries in my example. And then it'll keep running if it needs to. If not, it will stop. So those are some pointers on this program for the die simulation. And we've got some good information, a good example of when to declare a variable in a loop and let it get destroyed and recreated as the loop runs each time, versus declaring outside of the loop, creating a variable that's going to eat up memory, and that memory is going to be eaten up or used throughout the entire program, no matter how many times I reference these counters. So if I never use 6 count, I'm still holding and eating up that memory, which is fine because I might need to use it, versus Here, as soon as the loop is done, I no longer have an n variable. I've freed up that memory. And sometimes that's okay, and sometimes you can't do that. So we've seen a good example of that. Taking 6 different if statements and turning them into one if is a little more efficient, because when it finds the first match, it stops and doesn't keep checking after it's already found the match. And we saw that we really want the print lines in or outside of the loop, because we don't want them to print every single time the loop runs. We want them to print once when the program, or rather the loop, finishes right before the program is done. So those are some tips on how to run this die simulation. You could use a while loop as well. I like a for loop personally, but you can use either one. And so when we run the code, we got 2 6s, a 3, a 2, a 1, and a 4, and here are our statistics. A 1, 2, 3, 4. We didn't get any 5s, and we got 6 twice. So if you wanted to, you could also have your output look a little different by having everything on the same line, and then let's run it by taking out the print line and see what we get. So I've used a simple print with a space in between each number in the loop. Then I have forced a blank line with an empty print line here, and then I do a separate line for each of my statistics to give me a little different formatted output, make it a little easier for me to look right at it and go 2 6s, 0 4s, and so on. So hopefully that helps you with this assignment and helps you understand how to declare variables inside, out, and outside of a loop, how to use an if-else, and how to use a for loop.